In the late summer of 55 BC, Julius Caesar led a Roman invasion force of 2 legions onto the south coast of Britain. His men found themselves fiercely opposed by the native Britons, whose warriors defended the cliffs. Eventually, the Britons were driven off. Pursuit was impossible because the cavalry transports had become separated from the main fleet by a severe storm. The same weather all but destroyed the rest of the Roman fleet, leaving them stranded. Cut off from supplies, Caesar negotiated a truce, escaping back to the continent before the winter weather set in. But the restless power of Rome was not content to let this be the last word.
The simple answer to why Caesar invaded Britain was that it was there, and more importantly, that no Roman general had ever taken a Roman army there. No Roman general had ever crossed the ocean. And so this was a marvellous propaganda coup. It got Caesar masses of publicity.
He says the Gauls were receiving help from the Britons. There were close trading links between tribes in Britain and Gaul. And he claims that the Gauls, particularly those on the northwestern coast of France, were receiving assistance in their resistance to Caesar. So it was partly to go over and punish the Britons and try to prevent that help.
You have to see Caesar as essentially pursuing a military career to further his political career. And that his invasion of Britain is very much part of that. It's part of creating the glorious reputation that he requires to continue to hold power in Rome. So Caesar's invasion of Britain is very much wrapped up with Caesar's PR campaign.
Caesar returned the following year, 54 BC, with 5 legions, about 20,000 men, and 2,000 cavalry. This time, the Romans made an unopposed landing, probably on the eastern coast of Kent, near Sandwich. They stormed the hill fort at Bigbury and defeated the Cantiochi, who ruled the area, and after whom Kent is named. Caesar's chief opponent was Cassivellaunus, king of the Catuvellauni, who ruled territories north of the Thames, but the Roman was able to make use of British allies. He brought with him Mandubracius, whose father had ruled in what is now Essex and Suffolk. With this support, Caesar ventured across the Thames, moving eastwards along the north bank, receiving the subjection of the elders of the Trinovantes. But attacks on the Roman base camp by southern tribes once more forced an ignominious withdrawal.
Caesar may not have been intending to conquer Britain. Certainly in 55 BC it was a very small expeditionary force. The following year he went with a much larger force which could be construed as an invasion force. But basically he had other things on his mind. He was far more concerned with securing Gaul, that there were serious revolts in Gaul following his sojourn in Britain. And he needed to be near to Italy because political rivalries were starting to come to a head, and really he needed to ensure that he was close to Italy to intervene if necessary. Britain was a potentially exciting conquest, but with the size of the armies he had, it probably wasn't feasible.
Although Caesar's invasion did not result in conquest, it was an important step in bringing Britain into view as a potential province. Caesar's writings also provide some of the best information on how the Britons fought. Almost 100 years passed before the Romans launched another cross-channel invasion in AD 43. In the intervening century, they'd learnt much more about the island of Britain and had formed strong links with some rulers in the southeast. Commius established a realm based at Calaver, modern Silchester, north and south of the Thames around modern Reading. It was the rulers of the Catuvellauni who made themselves most powerful, though. Their kings conquered territories along the Thames Valley, including that of Calaver, by the 4th decade of the Christian era. This was chiefly under the leadership of Cunobeline, whose 3 sons, Togodumnus, Caratacus and Adminius, were to play major roles in the events of the mid-1st century AD. Adminius, who ruled in Kent and whose territories benefited from trade with the continent, seems to have been pro-Roman, while his 2 brothers were more suspicious. Family and political disagreements forced Adminius into exile in Gaul, where he sought Roman aid to regain his kingdom. Emperor Caligula may have been interested in such an expedition, but if so, it came to naught. Caligula, who had been tyrannizing Rome, was assassinated in AD 41 and succeeded by Claudius. The new emperor was approached by King Verica of the Atrebates to support him in the aggression of Caratacus, now based at Silchester. So, as so often happened in the growth of their empire, the Romans were invited in to resolve local disputes, and their military intervention became a conquest.
Claudius is in a very unusual political position for a new Roman emperor. Unlike most of his predecessors, unlike most great Romans before him, he has absolutely zero military reputation. He'd been brought up in a rather reclusive way. He'd never been seen by the imperial family as being emperor material, and he suddenly finds himself at a relatively advanced age the emperor of the Roman world. It's not something he planned for, it's not something he was trained for, but it then becomes very important for him to get the sort of glory and kudos which consolidates the power of an emperor. And you get glory and kudos as a Roman emperor largely from successfully masterminding campaigns.
Claudius had never in his life visited a legionary camp. He had no experience of military command. And so when, by accident, he became emperor, there was one large gap in his portfolio of qualifications, as it were. He had no military victories to his credit. So he did feel under some obligation to secure one. Where was he going to do it? Well, Britain had been on the imperial agenda for almost a century. Claudius's predecessor, Gaius Caligula, had contemplated an invasion of Britain, but then called it off. Claudius decides to take the plunge, go over there and ensure that he won military victory.
By the mid-1st century AD, Roman military power was supreme in Western Europe. On land, it depended upon the legions of heavy infantry, supported by auxiliary troops, mounted and on foot, which provided additional specialisms. Although the legion was theoretically composed of 10 cohorts of 480 men, with a double first cohort 800 strong, and 120 cavalry, totaling some 5,500 men, such numbers were rarely achieved in practice. This was partly because a legion once recruited was not always kept up to its original strength, and also because of the habit of forming vexillations, detachments of several hundred to 1,000 men for specific tasks. This has led to historians overestimating the size of imperial forces based on the official establishment rather than actual realistic strengths. There's no doubt that the Roman legionary was a formidable soldier, though. Exhaustively trained to handle his weapons, endure hardship and live frugally, he was also an adept military engineer. After marching 20 miles a day, the legionaries could construct a camp surrounded by a ditch, bank and palisade and pitch their leather tents for the night or longer. In the field, there were few opponents who could face the legionaries. Every man was equipped with metal armour covering his torso, made of either interlinked metal rings, mail, or flexible metal plates of banded iron. A helmet of iron or bronze, and large wooden shield, sometimes with a metal rim. His armament was a heavy throwing javelin known as pilum, with a short wooden shaft and a long metal head which was designed to bend or break off when sticking into an opponent's body or shield, making it impossible to use again. Each man carried 2 of these pila for throwing at close range, just before the hand-to-hand fighting, in which he wielded a short stabbing sword known as a gladius. Head down, under cover of their shields and working in close coordination with their comrades, the legionaries proved an unsurpassed killing machine in close combat. In contrast, the Gauls and Britons had longer, slashing swords and operated in looser order, which made best use of their warriors' enthusiasm and impetus.
One of the most important things is their discipline. This is something that comes with their training and professionalism. They're a very disciplined fighting force. This means that they can follow orders fairly easily on the battlefield. Command and control is quite an easy thing to do. It means that Roman soldiers can actually use their own initiative. If their officers aren't available, they can work as a unit themselves on the battlefield. So basically, they're professional, well-equipped, well-trained soldiers.
You look at a Roman legionnaire certainly compared to the enemies he faced in Britain. A Roman legionnaire is a fully clad, heavily armed infanteer, whereas his opponent is likely to be a very brave, ferocious warrior, but the most armoured protection a warrior is liable to have, even a relatively wealthy warrior, is going to be a helmet, a shield, and in extraordinary circumstances maybe a mail shirt. But that is very, very unusual. Most of the Britons that a Roman legionnaire would face in battle are going to be virtually naked.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything, from the wonders of ancient Pompeii and the mystery of the princes in the tower to the life of Anne Boleyn and D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description.
The Romans had never specialised in the mounted arm and usually recruited cavalry from their subject nations, notably the Gauls, who were famous exponents of mobile warfare. The Britons possessed a cavalry too. They continued in the use of the 2-horse chariot, which had been abandoned in Gaul 2 centuries earlier. They were far from being an anachronism, though. Beautifully constructed out of wood, wicker and leather, the chariot was a well-balanced fighting platform, as both contemporary accounts and modern reconstructions prove. Caesar praised British chariot tactics, saying, "First, they drive in all directions, hurling spears. Generally, they succeed in throwing the ranks of their opponents into confusion, just with the terror caused by their galloping horses and the din of their wheels." Caesar also learnt, though, that the Britons could not stand in the open field against his legions, and this lesson was passed down to the soldiers of Claudius's day. If they were to defend their territories, the Britons had to hold on to their hill forts or be forced into guerrilla warfare against the invaders.
The best hope that the Britons had of opposing the Roman invasion was to exploit geography, to exploit local knowledge of woods and marshes and river crossings, to hold up the Roman advance, to ambush the Romans when Roman armies were travelling through difficult country, and above all make it difficult for the Romans to secure a knockout blow in battle. If the Britons could organise themselves into a long drawn out guerrilla campaign, then they had a chance. But in order to do that, they had to accept that major British settlements, the political centres of tribal kingdoms, would have to be sacrificed to the Romans, and that was quite a high price for the Britons to pay, a higher price than many were prepared to pay.
The greatest defence for the island of Britain was, of course, the sea. But here too the Romans proved themselves masters of logistics. Emperor Claudius put the experienced soldier Aulus Plautius in charge of the expedition. Plautius commanded 4 legions drawn from the northern frontiers of the empire. He brought with him the 9th Hispana from his former posting of Pannonia in modern Hungary. The 20th Valeria and 14th Gemina came from the Rhine frontier, and the 2nd Augusta from the Rhone. Detachments from other legions may have brought these units to around full strength, giving a legionary force of 20,000 men. Their auxiliary troops probably equalled them in number, with perhaps 5,000 being cavalry. To these combat troops can probably be added another 5,000 servants, grooms and other men working in the baggage train, totaling some 40,000 men, and perhaps another 5,000 pack horses and mules, together with transport carts. A fleet of almost 1,000 ships would have been necessary to convey this force over the Channel. This total included the many transport vessels for the men, and specially adapted ones for the horses, together with fighting galleys to protect the convoys from attack. This formidable force landed unopposed, probably around Richborough in northern Kent, opposite the Isle of Thanet. The Britons declined to meet the Romans in the field, but took refuge in the swamps and forests, hoping in this way to wear their enemy down, so that they would sail away with nothing achieved, as did Caesar.
The British might have defeated the Romans if they'd been able to conduct a long drawn-out guerrilla campaign using local knowledge of the terrain, marshes, woods, rivers, mountains, etc. But such a guerrilla campaign entailed sacrificing the more accessible parts of the country, and in particular the political capitals of tribal kingdoms, to the Romans. And that sacrifice was quite a high price. Many Britons, especially tribal leaders, were not actually prepared to pay that price, because they had the opportunity to come to agreements with the Romans, to do a deal with the Romans, to ally themselves with the Romans, and to use the Romans to prop up their social and political position within their communities. It made sense to Romanize. It didn't necessarily make sense to oppose.
The Britons' reluctance to confront the invaders may have been due to a realistic appreciation that they did not have the numbers nor enough armoured men to match Romans in open battle. Whatever the case, the Roman forces proved sufficiently strong to force a crossing of the Medway in the face of opposition from Caractacus's warriors. They supposed that the Romans would not be able to cross without a bridge, and so had camped carelessly on the opposite bank. So Plautius sent across Gallic troops who were trained to swim with full equipment across the swiftest rivers. Then Vespasian led his legion, the 2nd Augusta, over, crossing the river and catching the barbarians by surprise, killing many of them. This was not the end of the fighting, for the Britons continued to resist on the Medway line until they were forced to fall back to the Thames estuary. Here, knowing the firm ground and the fords well, they crossed the river without difficulty, but the Roman forces were not so successful. Yet once again the Batavians forced a crossing, and the legions were able to follow, possibly using a causeway and bridge to reach East Tilbury marshes on the northern bank. Around this time, Togodumnus died, perhaps as a result of the fighting, weakening the Britons' resistance at a crucial moment. This enabled the Romans to sweep north of the Thames and seize the capital of the Cativalonians, renamed by the Romans Verulamium, now St Albans, and Camulodunum, which they called Colonia, now Colchester, belonging to the Trinovantes. This signified the subjection of two of the most powerful southern tribes, along with the already friendly Cantiaci of Kent and Atrebates of Sussex and Hampshire. The Romans now had control of the rich southeastern territories of Britain. It was at this moment that the Emperor Claudius paid a visit to his newly conquered lands. He only stayed for a fortnight. His visit was ceremonial, not military. For many hard campaigns were necessary before Roman law and taxes were to be fully imposed on Britain.
The invasion of AD 43 was extremely successful. Really, the Romans couldn't have wanted more from it. But it was successful for a number of reasons. Firstly, it had clear aims and a clear strategy. It was going to land, head north to the Thames, and then attack and capture the key British city of Colchester, which was the centre of one of the most powerful military tribes in southern Britain. So the intention is to destroy the Britain's military might as soon as possible.
Claudius cannot afford a setback or a defeat. He needs for political purposes to have a success. So the army that invades Britain is extremely well provided for. You've also got to remember that supporting that army is a network of Roman presence in Gaul and Western Germany, which has been there for some time. So it's not as if this is a Roman army projected from Italy. This is a Roman army projected from the Pas-de-Calais, supported by Roman resources in Northern Europe, largely, in many cases largely fought by Roman troops raised from Northern Europe. So it's a formidable invasion, and it's launched from much closer to Britain than for example, Caesar's earlier campaigns were launched into Gaul.
The conquest of Britain fell into 4 phases. The first had been successfully achieved by the end of AD 43, but there followed a decade of determined resistance. After Nero seized power in AD 54, he considered the possibility of abandoning the province. It was decided to persist, though, and by AD 58, it looked as if this was the right solution. Then, in AD 60, came the most serious revolt yet, that of Queen Boudica and her Iceni tribe. This was defeated with great difficulty, and reinforcements had to be rushed to Britain from other frontiers. The situation was restored in the 60s, and the border advanced to northern England. Then, in AD 78, the arrival of Agricola as governor led to the advance into and conquest of southern Scotland, eventually leading to the consolidation of the frontier on Hadrian's Wall after AD 122. Initially, though, the Romans operated with client kingdoms rather than making the whole island an imperial province. The best example of such a compliant native ruler is probably Togodumnus, whose authority extended over a wide area, including the towns of Silchester, Winchester, and Chichester. He has been associated with the extensively excavated palace at Fishbourne, revealing an owner of great wealth and influence. Not all British leaders were prepared to cooperate with the Romans, though, and Caratacus, the son of Canobalin, was determined to continue the fight. He retreated to the area of Salisbury Plain, where he drew support from the Dobuni tribe. Then, when driven out of there, he withdrew further into Wales. For the Roman advance was relentless. By the end of AD 45, they controlled territories bordered by a line drawn from Southampton Water up to the Wash, and all the ports east of it, giving access to the continent.
Caratacus was one of the 2 leaders of the most powerful British tribe in southeast England, the Cativaloni. He was able to initially oppose the Romans conventionally in a series of battles. The Romans rapidly overwhelmed them, inflicted fairly severe defeats on them, and conquered the heartlands of the Catavalone tribe. As he moved westwards, pursued by the Romans, so the style of fighting he adapted was increasingly a sort of low-intensity war guerrilla style of fighting. And that style of fighting, Caractacus discovered he was very good at. And for quite a long time, Caractacus managed to make himself very, very irritating to the Romans. In the 20th century, we sometimes get excited about guerrilla war and see it as being a wonderful panacea for the weak and the powerless in the face of the strong. The British experience against the Romans proves that if the strong are determined to carry on crushing you, they will eventually, however clever you are, however ingenious you are, however you use the deep forests and the mountains and the inaccessible areas of your own islands to protect you against the Romans, eventually methodical, overwhelming military power will win its day.
In AD 47, Plautius was replaced as governor by Ostorius Scapula, who had to deal with continued resistance. The Iceni of Norfolk began the trouble and were soon joined by their neighbours the Corytani, who inhabited territories south of the Humber and in the eastern Midlands. The Britons were subdued after some hard fighting, during which the governor's own son won an award for bravery. The result was that by the end of the year, the imperial border was pushed westward to include all the south coast, except the Devon-Cornwall Peninsula, reaching the Bristol Channel and extending along the Severn Trent rivers to the mouth of the Humber.
The Romans' main approach to siege warfare is simply to assault a place under cover of the shields, the very large shields that Romans were equipped with, forming the famous testudo, the tortoise formation, under which they could approach and storm enemy fortifications. And in Britain, those fortifications weren't that foreboding. The hill forts are comparatively minor fortifications compared to what some Roman armies are used to.
Vespasian led the way with his legion, the Second Augusta. Establishing his base on the great natural harbour now known as Poole, he pushed westwards into the territory of the Durotriges, storming their hill forts one by one. The largest and most famous of these was Maiden Castle, just outside Dorchester. A huge enclosure of steep ditches and banks, with entrances protected by serpentine approaches, it would have taken both skill and determination to assault. The defenders put down a storm of sling stones, while the Romans replied with archery and their bow-like artillery pieces, the ballistae. Amongst the corpses found at a gateway to Maiden Castle was a skeleton with a heavy metal bolt from one of these machines lodged in its head. Under cover from this supporting fire, the Roman legionaries formed a testudo, tortoise, covering themselves with their shields all around and fighting their way into the fiercely defended enclosure. By AD 50, Scapula was seriously concerned about the danger of raids by the Silures of southern Wales under the leadership of Caractacus. He instigated a search and destroy operation against this threat. First, he ordered the disarming of the tribes in occupied territory, which was done with great brutality and sowed the seeds of later rebellion. It did provide the governor with enough assurance to take half his forces into Wales. Caractacus withdrew into the territory of Snowdonia, which belonged to the Ordovices. This was because it was easier to defend and also protected the heartland of the Druidic religion based on Anglesey. Scapula's forces were composed of the 14th and 20th legions and cohorts from the other legions, about 10,000 in total, plus a similar number of auxiliary foot and cavalry. It's unlikely that Caractacus could have mustered half that number, and he sought to even the odds by taking refuge in difficult terrain, blocking of approaches, and taking up position behind a swift-flowing river. It was all to no avail, for the legionary testudos advanced unharmed, while their auxiliaries showered the Britons with missiles from the flanks. Caratacus escaped and sought refuge with Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes, but she turned him over, and he was taken to Rome to be displayed in a triumph.
He was taken to Rome in chains and presented to the Roman Senate in front of the Emperor Claudius as a trophy, if you like, of the success of the Roman invasion. Unusually, Caratacus was not ritually strangled, the usual punishment for enemy leaders. He gave a great speech to the Senate in which he asked, why did the Romans, who had all these great buildings, these great facilities and this wonderful civilization, why on earth did they want to conquer Britain, which had nothing? And Claudius was apparently so impressed by this speech that he allowed Caratacus to live in protective custody in Italy.
In AD 52, Scapula suddenly died, handing the initiative to the unsubdued Britons again. His successor, Didius Gallus, took 6 months to arrive from his former posting, and when he did, he was faced with the immediate threat of insurgency from the large northern confederation known as the Brigantes, under their queen Cartimandua. She had broken from her husband Venutius and taken up with a young charioteer named Velicatus, who was not of noble birth. Internal conflict turned into an attack on Rome, and it took the intervention of the 9th Legion, based at Longthorpe near Peterborough, to quell the rising. Under the experienced hand of Gallus, peace came to much of the new province, although the unsubdued tribes of Wales continued to be a problem. And the 14th was moved to Gloucester. In AD 57, he retired to be replaced by Quintus Veranius. The new governor subdued the Silures and established a legionary base at Usk, occupied by the 20th Legion. But he died within a year, and Suetonius Paulinus came to take his place.
I think you have to see the arrival of Rome being a fundamental challenge to the culture and the lifestyle of many Britons. And although Rome offers in many ways a much more sophisticated civilization and quite a gracious way of living, it's not the British way of living. It also takes power away from the very people who are also warriors. And you get back to the central difference between Roman and ancient British armed forces, that the ancient British armed forces are the armed forces of the privileged. So the very people who are suffering most from the Roman invasion, the very people whose political power has been taken away, whose freedom to live their quite pleasant lives in the ways they want to live their lives, they're the very people who constitute the armed forces of ancient British tribes, and therefore have a very strong reason to fight. However, I think you can exaggerate British resistance to Roman occupation. For every tribe that defiantly fights the Romans, there's at least one other tribe that accommodates with them. Quite a few British tribes do quite well out of working with the Romans.
While his predecessor had been an accomplished diplomat, Paulinus seems to have preferred military solutions, and his main objective was the conquest of the island of Mona, Anglesey, which was the headquarters of the Druids. Little is known of their religion, but there's no doubt that their travelling priests did much to foment opposition to Roman rule. Paulinus took a large proportion of the Roman forces on his expedition to North Wales, denuding the pacified province of its garrison. He was also completely unaware of how much bitterness there was about the Roman occupation. The Romans also constructed a vast temple at huge expense, which bore heavily upon the native population. Furthermore, upon the death of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, who was a client of Rome, they seized his lands to fund the project. Worst of all, when his queen objected to these exactions, she was whipped and her daughters were raped by the Roman tax collectors. Boudica rallied her own tribe and other discontented Britons to her chariot and launched an attack on Colchester, defended by only 200 soldiers. They held out for 2 days, but were massacred along with the entire civilian Roman population. Roman authors accuse the Britons of horrible mutilations and human sacrifices as a result.
The bulk of the Roman garrison of Britain has marched on Anglesey in Wales to settle matters once and for all with the Druids. There's virtually no military force in southeast England. The two big Roman settlements, what's now Colchester and Verulamium, what's now St Albans, are effectively undefended. So when these tribes suddenly revolt and sort of storm down from northern Norfolk, there's nothing to stop them.
Boudica's strategy was to strike at the nearest centres of Roman control, the nearest centres of Roman population, where the people who confiscated her properties, where the people who imposed taxation on her people resided. So she heads for Colchester and sacks the new settlement. She heads for St Albans and then on to the major settlement in Roman Britain, Londinium. And because each of these settlements has only a very small garrison of soldiers or people with military experience, she can destroy them and collect enormous booty. And she creates a bandwagon. She appears to be successful. People join her because they want to get in on the act and get their share of the pillage of Roman wealth.
There was nothing to stop the rebels from marching on London, which did not have any proper defences. The city was sacked, and further atrocities were inflicted upon the population. Any Roman whom they could catch, the Britons killed. Boudica then led her forces north to Verulamium, which was also razed to the ground. Paulinus still held the 14th and 20th legions, and may have ordered the 2nd Legion up from Exeter, but if so, its commander dared not leave the camp in the face of British opposition. Nevertheless, Paulinus marched his army, perhaps 12,000 strong including auxiliaries, down Watling Street from North Wales towards London. Somewhere in the Midlands, possibly at Manchester, not far from modern Coventry, the Romans came up against Boudica's forces advancing northwards. Roman historians credit the Britons with almost 250,000 men. Real numbers are difficult to determine. It's not even certain that they equaled the Romans in fighting men, for many of the Britons are described as being women and children in wagons, accompanying their menfolk on the plundering raid which the rebellion had become. This unhelpful baggage train was drawn up behind the mass of warriors in what proved to be a fatal formation. The Romans, as ever, were drawn up in careful order, the legionaries in the centre supported by the auxiliary foot, and then the cavalry on the wings. Paulinus had also chosen a good defensive position, just off the road, with woods and steep hill at his back, in order that he should not be outflanked by the mobile Britons. His exhortation, as recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus, embodies the different style of fighting between the two forces. Ignore the noises and empty threats made by these savages. There are more women than men in their ranks. They have no armor or proper weapons, and will break when they feel your steel and sense the courage of men who have beaten them so many times already. Keep close order. When you have thrown your javelins, push forward with the bosses of your shields and swords. Let the dead pile up, forget about plunder, win the victory, and it's all yours.
You have to bear in mind the Iceni hadn't encountered the main Roman army. The main Roman army is in Wales with Paulinus. It returns from that campaign to discover the province in chaos, the two major Roman urban centres sacked by the Iceni, and a portion of the 9th Legion having been exterminated on their way south. But none of these are major battlefield successes for the Iceni. Contrary to popular history, Paulinus must have approached this confrontation with Boudica without much trepidation. After all, he had the trained army, he was the experienced general, and he was fighting yet another motley collection of British tribesmen. And in this case, in the Iceni, the bedrock of the of the rebel army. The Iceni had abandoned for quite some time the warrior tradition of British tribes. And these are soft and pampered tribesmen, not hardy tribesmen of the West, the sort that Caractacus had led against them.
After skirmishing and taunts, the Britons rushed forward into a barrage of javelins which took down their first rank. Then, as had happened so often before, the legionaries drove into the enemy ranks, their short swords stabbing out from behind their shields, pressing the enemy back into a killing ground of the Britons' own making, forced onto a rampart of wagons behind their lines. The result was a massacre. No one knows what happened to their warrior queen. Boudica is reputed either to have committed suicide or simply died of an illness. It was probably as a result of their victory that the 2 Roman legions were awarded the title Victrix.
Paulinus doesn't make the mistake of underestimating the Iceni. He recognises them as a serious threat. His men fight accordingly, and they win, as a Roman legionary army is likely to win any pitched battle against the less organised, the less well-equipped British opposition.
After the Boudican revolt, there was quite a lull in further Roman advances in Britain. There was quite a long period of consolidation. The Romans realised that they needed to ensure the province was properly pacified before further advances. Then interests were drawn elsewhere by a period of civil war. But the new dynasty then decides that it could do with further conquests in Britain in order to boost its military reputation. And so the conquest of Roman Britain resumes in the 70s with campaigns to the north, up the Pennines and towards Scotland, and also into Wales. So for the first time, concerted attempts are made to conquer Wales, and there is a gradual move to the north.
It was Gnaeus Julius Agricola, who became governor in AD 78, who completed the conquest. The new governor already had experience of Britain, having served during the Boudican revolt, and later commanded the 20th Legion. His campaigns were notable for the way he combined his land forces with the ships of the Classis Britannica, the provincial fleet. In 79, he completed the conquest of Anglesey, and in the following year began campaigning in Scotland.
Agricola was extremely successful because, first, he was a good leader of men, but equally importantly, he was a brilliant organiser of military operations. These qualities enabled him to push his forces into central Scotland and then to organise the control of this territory with a very extensive system of fortresses, watchtowers, legionary camps, all backed up by active marching and counter-marching of the Roman army, supported too by the Roman fleet. It was brilliant military organisation driven by a highly ambitious man who was also an extremely good general.
The Scottish border was not really secured for another generation, when Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of his famous wall. Yet there could be no doubt that Britain was now a Roman province, a land of towns, roads, baths and theatres like anywhere else within the empire. The conquest was complete.
When the Romans had decided that it wasn't really worth conquering Scotland because there was so little economic or military gain by doing so, it made sense to create some form of defensive structure.
Hadrian ordered the construction of a wall across North Britain from roughly Newcastle to Carlisle to act as a line of demarcation between the area which was solidly under Roman control, which was liable to Roman taxation, to separate that from the area outside where, yes, the Romans would have influence, but where their control was not quite so great.
There were peoples to the north of Hadrian's Wall who probably felt themselves part of the Roman Empire. So it's not a clear demarcation line, it's not a frontier line in the way that we would think of a modern administrative frontier.
The wall was what it appears to be, a barrier.
The Roman conquest of Britain led to nearly 400 years of occupation and inclusion in one of history's great empires. The impact upon the culture, the landscape and the economy of the island province ran deep. For the Romans too, conquest of this northern isle was yet another testament to the empire's might and a valuable addition to its resources. Under the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, towns flourished and the economy boomed, helped by the network of roads, built and maintained in a way that had never been seen in the island before. These developments were only possible because of the agricultural and economic surplus produced under imperial protection. Yes, the Britons paid taxes to far-off Rome, but the benefits were made manifest in stone, much still to be explored by archaeology today. The province did not become untenable until after Rome itself had been sacked in AD 406. Only then did the legions retreat, leaving a still functioning, recognizably Roman civilization, which lasted at least another century until Germanic barbarians, Angles, Saxons and Jutes finally overran it.